Hello and welcome to today's video. Now, this one is going to focus on three specific things that the League of Nations were involved with, and they're important things to remember as they can randomly come up in an exam. And the three things we're going to look at is the Locarno treaties, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the Disarmament Conference. And these all happen in three different years: 1925, 1928, and the Disarmament Conference in 1932. And ultimately lasting to 1937, though it's more the beginning part of the Disarmament Conference that we're going to focus on. Now, the reason that we look at these is because a lot of the time they're stated as, well, partly a kind of successes of the League of Nations, but when we look deeper into these and delve deeper, we can really ultimately see that, once again, these three things were failures of the League of Nations. So the first one we're going to start with is this source here, which is done by David Lowe, and it's of a woman who is representing Europe, as it says on the bottom of her dress, and she's taking the next step. Now, where is the next step? Well, she's already achieved the doors plan, which is this stepping stone in the bottom left, which we looked at in the last video, which is where America would help Germany with reparation payments, and it would go around in a circle. So Germany gets loans off America, and Germany gives their money to France and Britain, and France and Britain give their loan money from World War I back to America. And that was seen as a big success, and David Lowe saw it as a success as well. Now, the next stepping stone that Europe is standing on is called Locarno, and this is about the Locarno Pact. And as you can see, David Lowe at this time sees Locarno as a success as well. That's just to start off to that cartoon, because we're going to look now specifically at what the Locarno Pacts were. Now, they occurred in 1925, and before that, Germany had never really openly accepted the borders that had been enforced by the Treaty of Versailles. They'd been very reluctant to, as we have seen, they saw the Treaty of Versailles as a diktat and had been forced upon them. So it was of a great positive sign that in 1925, Gustav Stresemann, foreign minister for Germany at the time, offered to voluntarily sign the Locarno Pact with the League of Nations. And what it was that the Locarno Pact ensured the frontiers of Germany, France, Belgium, all the frontiers that had been outlined in the Treaty of Versailles, that Germany guaranteed those, and all the other countries obviously were going to guarantee those as well. But the important thing is here that Germany voluntarily agreed to this. They went out of their way to get the Locarno treaties signed and guarantee their borders, and in a way accept what the Treaty of Versailles had said. And this was a massive deal, as halfway through the 1920s, and it seemed like peace had finally been assured. Like, I know with the Treaty of Versailles it seemed like peace had been assured, but by this point it seemed completely guaranteed that it had finally succeeded, because there had been huge German resentment towards the Treaty of Versailles. Now, it is seen as a success, the Locarno treaties, but we have to remember that Stresemann in particular, and part of the German and the Weimar government at the time, did not represent all of the German population at the time. And this treaty, if anything, really did not destroy complete German resentment. There was still huge amounts of resentment in Germany. And one of the key figures in ensuring this resentment was the Nazi Party and even the Communist Party as well in Weimar Germany. So it is seen as a success, but eventually, when Hitler comes to power, he completely ignores the Locarno treaties and just goes and takes advantage of the weak borders, so takes the Rhineland, and ultimately the League of Nations do nothing about that. So Locarno at the time can be seen as a success, but really ultimately it was just a piece of paper that a lot of Germans didn't agree with, and when push came to shove in the 1930s, when Hitler took the Rhineland and other areas and didn't respect the frontiers, the League of Nations did nothing about it, and the Locarno Treaty was forgotten about. So the next one we need to focus on is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. of 1928, which was a huge decision by the League of Nations, which now included Germany as well, because after Locarno, Germany joined the League of Nations as she was accepted in. It was the major decision to outlaw war, to completely make it a huge crime, criminal offence to commit any kind of acts of war and renounce it altogether. And it sounds like an amazing thing, and it was a big deal. It was a huge deal. It was put forward, and it was this idea, finally, war, it's not allowed. No one can do it ever again. It's never going to happen again. And we have to remember that this is only 10 years later from the end of World War One. It was still fresh in people's minds, World War One, and they were desperate to never have this happen again. And we have to remember that in the 1920s and into 1930s, people were desperate for peace. They never wanted to have to experience anything like World War One ever again. So to have the League of Nations and leaders of the world sit down and actually decide to outlaw war and renounce it altogether was a huge, major thing, and that was the Kellogg-Briand Pact. But the major problem with this, and this is what ultimately happened, it was just a statement, really. There's nothing to really enforce. What happened to those people if they did decide to go to war? As I've written here, it made no attempt to define aggression. It made no attempt to define, well, if someone is aggressive, what does that look like? And ultimately, when it comes to the 1930s, and we can look back in hindsight, it didn't avoid war, and people did just go to war and completely ignored the Kellogg-Briand Pact by the end of the 1930s. So when we come to David Lowe's cartoon again, these are huge successes. Dawes, Locarno, and I know it hasn't mentioned Kellogg-Briand Pact, but the next step after those two things is the third stepping stone, which is disarmament. And as you can see, the gap between Locarno, which I'm going to just scribble in blue, and disarmament is huge. And even David Lowe knows that maybe this is a bit of a too difficult step to reach. And as we'll look at the disarmament conference now, it ultimately was too difficult a step to reach. Now, what was it? Well, it was set up in 1932 by the League of Nations, and the main aim of the disarmament conference was that everyone must disarm. Every nation would disarm. Remember, one of the key aims of the League of Nations, which was KEEP, was to make everyone disarm, encourage people to disarm and cooperation. And it sounded like a great idea, it really did, and everyone was up for it. There was a huge swathe of popular support for disarmament. The huge amounts of the British public really pushed the League of Nations for them to disarm. The huge petitions and protests, and Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister at the time, was saying we're going to go to Geneva and we're going to disarm and it's going to be the best thing ever. But ultimately it was a fantasy. It was a huge fantasy, because when push came to shove and everyone sat down at the disarmament conference and everyone started to talk, there was huge differences and no one could make any kind of agreement. The main issue was that Germany wanted to rearm. It wanted to rearm. Because remember, at the end of World War One, according to the Treaty of Versailles, the German country had to disarm and was put down to a very small level of armaments. But unfortunately, who wasn't going to be happy with that? Well, it was France. They wanted the opposite. They didn't want Germany to disarm at all. They didn't want Germany to be at the same level as France, and France also were reluctant to disarm at all, because they didn't feel protected at all by this idea of everybody disarming. And then when it come to shove again, everyone else was reluctant to disarm. There was a great quote by the Polish I think he was the ex-Polish leader at the time, and he said, when it comes to disarmament, it's like the other guy's got to do it first. There was this idea like, well, I'll disarm if you disarm first. And this complete debate just went round and round and just didn't get anywhere. So the disarmament conference was a huge failure. It was even more of a failure was that when Germany weren't allowed to rearm and France weren't willing to listen to what they had proposed, they walked out. And then when they came back to the conference in 1933, now instead Hitler was in charge. He said again, right, are we going to let us to rearm? And Are we all going to go to the same level or what? They just wouldn't form any agreement. So what happened is that Hitler just decided, well, I'm leaving the Disarmament Conference and I'm also going to leave the League of Nations. And that was a huge, it was a big excuse for Hitler to leave the League of Nations, because he just, in a way, showed up the contradictory nature of the League of Nations. And the last thing we're just going to look at is this cartoon, once again, by David Lowe. And he's depicted the League of Nations here as a crocodile, tigers, hyenas, wolves. Okay, so big predators with big teeth, strong, powerful, and they're addressing the common people of the world, who are all depicted as sheep. And he says the conference is excusing itself with its crocodile tears, which means it's fake tears, and stated, "My friends, we have failed. We just couldn't control your warlike ambitions." So basically saying that it's not the League's fault that we couldn't disarm, even though, we're crocodiles and tigers and wolves and whatnot. It's just that at the end of the day, you guys just didn't want it to happen, even though you're a bunch of sheep, and that, ultimately you just want peace. He's really been harsh on the League of Nations here, and stating that they're lying, and he's been overly sarcastic towards their position. But ultimately, the reason why I've looked at these three here is to show some might see it as a success in putting them in place in the first place. So Locarno, that was a success at the time, and Kellogg-Briand Pact and actually forming a disarmament conference were huge successes at the time. But ultimately, when it came to the end of them, all three of them failed. All three of these things failed, and they are major reasons why also the League of Nations failed.